Can everyone hear me? Oh,
Yes, we can.
thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. Um, Online participants, can you hear me?
Yes, we
Yes, we
can.
can hear
Okay,
you.
thank
Yes,
you
we
Thank
very
can
you.
hear
much.
you.
Thank
Thank
you
you
very
very
much.
much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out to spend your Monday afternoon with us. We know how busy Mondays can be, management meetings, so many emails to catch up on. So we do not take your time for granted. And for you to be here, it only means one thing, just even commitment towards building a better Nigeria. Thank you very much for being here. This event is scheduled to run from now till about 4 p.m. So we'll try to make it as short as possible just so that you have the rest of the day to yourselves. Um, I much I'd love to recognize everyone present here, but in the interest of time, please permit me to collectively welcome everyone. Once again, thank you for being here. To give the opening remark, I will invite Esiri Agbeyi, partner at PwC. But before then, quick introduction. My name is Oluwatoyin David. I'm an associate director at PwC Nigeria. Welcome, everyone. Esiri, over to
Mic is working so well, eh? But good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to have everyone here. This is an event that we've put together with Ford Foundation. Hello? So I'll try this one. Okay. It's nice. All right. So this is something we've put together with Ford Foundation primarily, and we're doing this in honor of the president of the Ford Foundation, who will be here in a bit and been stuck in traffic at Folomo roundabout, but is almost here. So what's the reason we're here for? As you see, the topic is around sustainable giving. One of the things that we've invested in a lot in PwC is working with private businesses. And according to our statistics, Nigerians give large. We are very high in terms of charity. But where we seem to fall short is in terms of doing this strategically and sustainably. So what you find is that sometimes, at least in your local communities, there's a lot of giving of food, perhaps just helping with healthcare. But sometimes once the founders that are closely or passionately associated with those givings go, they don't seem to continue. But Ford Foundation is born out of the passion of one person, Henry Ford, who over the years has built a structure to last. And one of the interests of Ford Foundation is to see how we can share that with the wider region. The key crisis that we're dealing with now is that there's a lot of organizations who are pulling back in terms of giving funds to Africa. And you might see that activity happening as it relates to vaccine production, big time, high level ticket kind of giving, pulling back sometimes because of a lack of structure and identification of partners to work with. It was on that note we thought, oh, why don't we find those who are already giving in this space and look at how we can give for more and give more strategically. It's coming at a time where we're having some economic crisis relating to healthcare of our people, but even the economics, the macroeconomic indicators do not hold well in our favor. So we're here today to discuss the philanthropy ecosystem. We're here to talk about experiences, and I'm glad we've watched one of the videos already of some of the good things that's happening in this space. We also would love to hear from you, but more importantly is how can we make this space better for the communities that we are so passionate about? How can we work hand in hand to contribute or amplify the givings that we're doing? And in what areas do we need to spend more time on? We've tried to do a heat map around this to look at the sectors where we find a lot of giving, But again, sometimes data is hard to find in this space. And so we're trying to make sure we have the right touch points and grow this ecosystem as we go into, hopefully, a very positive future for Nigeria. So on that note, I think we'll quickly move on to the next agenda, where I'll have one of my colleagues, Shegun Zacchaeus, just give a run round of what the ecosystem is like. You'd see some of that already printed in the brochure you've been given. There's a lot of detail there. So also spend some time looking at that as well. And if there's anything that we've missed, please call us out on that. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Esiri, for setting the tone really nicely. Mr. Shegun Zacchaeus, over to you. Can we have his presentation up, please? Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shegun Zacchaeus, as introduced. I lead PwC strategy and practice within West Africa, and I'm happy to be here. I think my task is a bit very easy because you already have the pre-read and you have all the answers in the brochure in your hand. But I think it's important to look at the philanthropic landscape from a more strategic perspective. And what I'll do is to sort of reflect on what the ecosystem looks like and talked about some of the challenges, we as PwC see as bedeviling the philanthropy ecosystem. And it's important because coordination of philanthropy is very, very important for us to achieve more maximal impact. And as Syria said, what you realize is that there's so many fragmented interventions that do not cohere to create a stronger impact within Nigeria. Let me just move through the slides. The slide essentially reflects on what the components of the ecosystem are, talks about what challenges we're facing and some initial thoughts, how we can begin to address those challenges. So if you look at the slide on the screen, and I'm sure this should not be new to everyone, there are the different type of philanthropic organization. We have the traditional and we have the faith-based, and as we know, the faith-based element of philanthropy is doing quite a lot, right? We have those that are corporate, that are organizational-led, and in which an organization will set up its own philanthropy entity, and we begin to see a lot more entities doing that as a way of giving back and also achieving their SDG target. We have an example on the board, and we have MTN Foundation and several other philanthropy organizations. I think the last point, the last type of philanthropy organization we have on the screen is what we call a bit more structured organization, in which philanthropy is professionalized, right? And we have example of TEF on the screen as an example to look at. So these are the different type, if you want to put them into archetypes, right? If we move on and then ask the question, when you look at the ecosystem, what are the components? And it's important for us to reflect on this, because it is until you understand the component of the ecosystem, you can begin to think on how best to bring everything together in order to achieve a maximum impact within the community and in the economy, right? And this is what we have. We have individual donors. I guess all of us in one way or the other are individual philanthropists, right? We have foundations. We talked about that. We have corporate giving programs. We have NGOs that work within this space. We have community group, and it's also important the role of policymaker. And the last bit is legal and fiscal frameworks, and that begins to talk about the conversation. How do you get tax benefits, for the philanthropic activities you do within your community? If we then move on, as I wrap up, to ask ourselves the question, what is limiting us maximizing the impact of philanthropy within Nigeria? And when we work with clients, we typically do something called economic impact assessment, right? If you bring, all the spending on philanthropy together into a bucket, I'm sure the impact of that on Nigeria economy will be far more significant than even some sectors of the economy, right? But because this is fragmented, you can't really achieve that kind of impact. But what are the issues, right? Obviously, the issue of funding and investment. I'll speak to this. I'll just highlight the list. Inefficient utilization of resources, lack of collaboration or coordination amongst entity of the ecosystem, transparency and accountability, limited community engagement, short-term focus, and the limitation within the legal and fiscal policy. Let me speak a bit on each. I think the concept of funding and investment is very important, because what you typically see is you see philanthropy that stays the life of the primary funder, right? And after the funder is gone or the source of funds maybe get lowered, philanthropic activity reduces. But there are several structures you can sort of create to ensure that if you have a certain fund, you can create endowment etc. to ensure that there's longevity in your ability to make impact, right? We see a lot of that, and I'm sure you've all heard story of Ibadan when we had one very rich man that would feed hundreds of people almost every Friday. After that rich man passed on, I don't think that thing, still continued, right? So I think that's a very first limitation that we have, and we call that term financial sustainability, right? It means what you do now, you should be able to continue to do it over a longer period, right? That's a major challenge that we see within this landscape. Another important point I would like to raise is around lack of transparency and accountability. And it's usually in the way these philanthropic benefits are administered, right? If there are no systemization, you don't audit the organization that does the philanthropy, you realize that there's very limited transparency, which also affect the organizational sustainability of the philanthropic entity or the philanthropic giving. I think the last point I'll talk about is limited community engagement. And I think a lot of time there's a misalignment between the intention of the giver and the need of the community you want to intervene in, right? And the only way you get to understand what's appropriate for your community of target or your beneficiary of target is when you have engaged them, you really understand their need, and not need at surface level, it's need almost at the bottom layer in which you understand these are the needs. And when you understand that, you know the best way to intervene, right? Because what we see right now is that a lot of philanthropic giving just goes down the drain without achieving the kind of benefit you want the beneficiaries to have, right? And what can we do? There are several important things we can do, right? Obviously, around innovative financing, active community engagement, ensure there's impact assessment, right? I think for me it's very important. The hallmark of transparency in any given, any foundation is after you've done that, a year after, we spend X amount to help these people. Have we achieved that direct impact? Have we achieved the indirect impact, right? I think monitoring, evaluation, and assessing the impact is really critical for any philanthropic activities that we do. I think the last point, I'll just sort of align, sort of close this on, is really also tying this back to the Sustainable Development Goals, right? And as we do our intervention, as we look at our beneficiary, the question is what element of this SDG are we sort of attacking, right? In summary, I think the landscape in terms of volume is quite significant, but in terms of coordination, I think it's extremely fragmented. In terms of impact, I think we have pockets of impact, but I believe there's a lot we can do when the ecosystem is strengthened and there are better collaboration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Olusegun Zacchaeus. So there's going to be a switch in the agenda. What you have in front of you should be a panel session right after that session. But we're going to move to the fireside chat with the president of Ford Foundation, Darren Walker. Thank you very much for being here. Let's have the chairs, please. So this will be moderated by the publisher of Business Day Media Limited, Mr. Frank Aibogo.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We will get to do this very quickly. How long do we have? 1-5 or 5-0? Thank you. Darren, welcome back to Nigeria again. And it's such a pleasure. Let's do this quickly. Tell us as much as you can and as much as time will permit. What is the real motivation for Ford Foundation for the work that it does in the area of philanthropy?
Well, thank you very much, and thanks to PwC for hosting us, and thank you all for coming. It is indeed a delight to be back in Nigeria, to be back in Lagos, this city that continues to dazzle and confound me in its amazing complexity and richness. I love this city, and I always love being here. I would say that the Ford Foundation is motivated by a simple idea that we believe every person deserves to live with dignity. And in a world where there is less poverty and less inequality, and indeed ultimately no poverty and inequality. So our work here through our office and my wonderful colleagues, Titi Dabasaki and so many others, we are focused on the issues specifically of gender-based violence, of the challenges of natural resources and extractive economy to ensure that there is more shared prosperity and greater opportunity for all. And our grant making reflects that. We've actually been in Nigeria longer than Nigeria has existed. This has been for us one of the great pleasures and honors to be here to serve the aspirations and dreams of the Nigerian people.
Thank you very much. The experience we have is that foundations typically focus on their area of locality. I mean, they just sit there. But Ford Foundation has a global footprint. And I am sure that if we were to look at it, and I haven't looked at it, we may find that Ford is impacting the world more out of America than it does, if at all, in America itself. Tell me, what is the point of that?
Well, we were founded as an international foundation. A part of our mission is to support and strengthen democracy, to increase awareness among nations and peoples, and to build relations. We, of course, have a major footprint in the United States. In fact, there are some in the United States who criticize the Ford Foundation for working internationally and not deploying 100% of our resources on problems of America. But it is indeed our mission, and it is a part of our DNA to work internationally. And there are themes in our work when you work internationally. The way in which power is distributed, the way elites and the wealthy hoard, the way in which in the Western Hemisphere, anti-blackness as a reality from America to Brazil is the lived experience of people of African descent, and share. There is a shared heritage in combating racism. Globally, the issues of gender and the bias, the reality of patriarchy and what that does to subjugate the dreams and aspiration of women and girls is universal. And so when you work on these things as an international foundation, there's a through line in your grant making. There is a consistency and a coherence, so that when you bring all of the staff together, whether it's in Delhi or New York or Rio, and you're working on issues of gender-based violence, there are themes from South Africa to New York, and the way in which this manifests. And our grant makers are working to support organizations on the front lines combating this scourge.
Thank you very much. When we listened to Segun, he spoke about longevity. He spoke about sustainability. Ford Foundation is almost 100 years old. And so the question is, how do you manage to achieve such longevity? In fact, it appears every year your impact grows. So the years don't result in a waning of impact. How do you manage to do that? Because I mean, there are people here who are leading various foundations in Nigeria doing great work. And in my table where I sat, I had, some great stories. And it was a question of how do you continue this into the future ahead of us?
Well, I think I agree with you. There is some remarkable philanthropy and philanthropists in this country, and some extraordinarily generous people who have done well and who are indeed giving back. I think the challenge, and I can certainly from the U.S. perspective address the issue, if you want something to live in perpetuity as Henry Ford did, then you establish an endowed foundation, and as the Ford Foundation is. That original stock of Ford Motor Company that we received from from Edsel Ford's estate is what we live off of. We're not a fundraising organization. We have an endowment, depending on the day, 15 billion, some days less, some days more. But that's what we live off of, and that's what we give away the income, 5 to 6% every year. One of the real challenges, to be totally candid, and that's the only way I know how to be, is again a universal challenge for the wealthy and for those who want to give. And I'll give a scenario, something that happened with me, because I'm often visited by, in the U.S., people who have, in a number of years, made billions, have really made tremendous wealth. And I was visited by a young billionaire who said, well, I've been to Africa, I've been to Uganda with my wife and my kids, and we traveled around rural Uganda, and we've come back and we've decided we want to start a rural health program in Uganda. And I said to him, who in Uganda asked you to do this? And what I meant by that was, it was a typical northern, I want to go and help. And he said, well, we want to start, and we're going to call it the John Smith Family Foundation, blah, blah, blah. And I said, but there are already so many rural health programs in Uganda. But we want to do it this way, and my children want to be involved. And so it became clear that it was as much about him as it was about them. And that's a real challenge. We all have egos. We all, let's see my name, but ego and logo can get in the way of progress. And that is a real hard thing, because if you have succeeded and you've done well, you want to be able to give back. But it's not just, and you have my book there, one of the things I say in my book, and a piece I wrote in the New York Times, which did not go over well with some people, was I talked about being at one of these galas with all the billionaires in Manhattan, and I felt like I was eating lobster on the Titanic, because it's not just about giving back. We may have to give up something. And that's the harder conversation, because we like what we have, and we've worked hard to earn it. But when we look out into the world, and again, I'm speaking as an American in my own country, and there is greater inequality. There is a larger gap between the haves and have-nots. Then this is a long-term problem, not just for our economy, but for our democracy. Hope is the oxygen of democracy. And when you have a population of people who are hopeless, it is very hard for democracy to thrive. And again, I say this from the perspective of my own country, a democracy we're very proud of, but which is threatened in part because of growing inequality in America.
Fantastic. Fundamental. How do you help, or what advice would you have for philanthropies in their transition from charity to development?
Well, it's what I write about in the book is this idea of moving from charity, from generosity to justice and dignity. And those are different ideas for philanthropy. Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, who wrote the book on American philanthropy, and in Carnegie's seminal 1887 essay, he said, the work of wealthy men like myself is to give back, is to be charitable. In fact, Carnegie coined the term to give back. He also, in the context of the U.S., framed this idea that some people are undeserving of charity because they're lazy, because they don't want to work, because they're slovenly, et cetera, et cetera. He wrote this. And you see this in America today. There is a sentiment in our society of people saying, oh, she's a single mother with 3 children. What bad choices she's made. She doesn't deserve. We have that in our society in the United States. And one of the challenges is how we, meaning we privileged, change our mindset to understand and see the humanity in everyone, and to see that we, through our charity sometimes and through our own backgrounds, we are implicated in the very problem we're trying to solve. And what I mean by that is a generosity and charity mindset is one where you say, oh, but for the grace of God, go me. I could have been that way, but I'm not, because I've worked harder, I've studied harder, I've sacrificed. All the things that we successful people tell ourselves that separate those who have had bad fortune, who may have had made poor choices. But my mother was a single mother. My mother had 4 children. She was a poor black woman in the American South. There were not a lot of choices. And so it would be easy for someone to look at my mother and say, you made bad choices, you deserve to be poor and living in that little shack. A justice mindset says and interrogates in the privilege a conversation in our own heads about what am I doing to contribute? What are we doing? And I'll give an example. At the Ford Foundation, one of our major areas of focus in the U.S. was reducing the number of prisons, because we have a justice system, a criminal justice system in America that was designed to lock up black people. And so we have a disproportionate number of African Americans, of Latinos, but particularly African American men. And I know this because I have cousins who have been in prison and still are in prison. At the same time, the Ford Foundation was investing and supporting organizations fighting to end the private prison construction in the United States. Through our multi-billion-dollar investment, our endowment, we were investing in private prison companies. Because guess what? There's a lot of money in America to be made in prison construction. And a lot of investors have invested in the construction of prisons. And so on the one hand, we're saying, oh, here are these great investment opportunities for me to put my money to work. And I'm going to get a good return. And with that return, I'll be able to be a better philanthropist. But at the same time, that was actually destroying the very society we want to see. A society with fewer black and brown people locked up, with fewer prisons. And so we had to interrogate our own behavior, our own complicity, our own implication, and the very problem we were saying we were solving.
Fantastic. You know, my last question was about the book, but Darren has spoken so eloquently about the book already. And I like the linkage to justice. I think that for all, and we all do have conscience, I think that resonates very well. and I must congratulate you for this book. It's a gift, a rare gift, and I'm sure a copy is available for everybody. Don't just take it home.
Of course.
Please read it.
Thank you very much.
But I must close with this question. When you come to Nigeria and you are not busy at work, what do you do?
Well, first of all, when I come to Nigeria, my schedule is
Not
full.
about the go-slow, please.
No, no, no. I have to say, when I come to Nigeria, you have to understand that because most of you are not me. I am a black man who lives in America. I'm a person of African descent. I'm not African. And so when a person of African descent from America comes to Africa, to any African country, but particularly West Africa, because of the connection with West Africa, where most of the enslaved people were brought to the Americas, when you come here, there is a visceral, emotional, psychological thing that happens to you. You can't relate to it because you're born here. You are Africans. You are Nigerians. It is profound, and it is palpable in my own head just how comfortable, how when I see people who look like, I mean, when I moved to Harlem, I lived when I moved to New York, I lived in Harlem, which, you know, of course we like to say we have made such progress, and I mean, still very segregated then, and to just be on the subway, be walking around 125th Street or such, and to see mostly black faces. And then when I come here, and you're seeing mostly black faces, and you see people who look like your uncle, or you see people who look like the person you saw on the street on 125th Street in Harlem. And so that's what it's like for me. I want to also acknowledge my great Ford Foundation trustee, Benga Oyebode, who is here. Thank you, Benga, for being here, as always. For those of you who don't know, but you probably do know Benga, he's been on the Ford Foundation board now for some 5+ years. He chairs our mission investments, which has been a major thrust of my term as president, to have more of our investments. And Benga, we have allocated $1 billion for this kind of investment. And thank you, Benga, for chairing that committee and your great advice and counsel to everyone and the trustees has been so valued and valuable. So thank you.
Do you have any jollof experience to share with us? Jollof experience.
Jollof rice. Oh, the rice this afternoon. I didn't know it was called jollof. I learn something new every day. Well, this is, again, another cultural tradition that is so resonant with me, because growing up in the American South, in every black family, rice is a staple. It's just a staple, and it is with everything. And it is very different because culturally, when I come to Africa, again, the consistency of my own lived experience and the roots of my heritage, I'm just reminded of it, even though I don't always know the name.
As long as you enjoy, that's fine. Can we please give a round of applause to Darren? Thank you very much. Thank you.
Oh, picture. Of course, we're in Africa. We have to take pictures. Back to take pictures. I love it. Thank you, sir.
Um, yes, I'm so happy that we have your book. I'm a secret admirer of your work, so thank you so much. My name is Sarah Bulos. I run the Society of the Performing Arts Nigeria. We are a sustainable organization, non-profit, and one of my questions in the business of community, direct community access, we just don't only give money, we're actually there. I teach, I educate. So my question is, when you heard what Mr. Zacchaeus was talking about, what was your first instinct to do?
When I heard,
Mr. Zacchaeus was
yes.
talking about
Yes.
something that he's looking at from a lot of organization giving money, things happening, and then something else happening.
yes,
And it's around the area of ability community. So I'm an African. I was born in Burkina Faso, even if I'm white. So it's very interesting. I'm a U.S. citizen too. I'm just sharing with you that this is something that's interesting because I'm hearing what Mr. Zacchaeus is saying. I'm processing it. I was just curious to find out, how did you process it?
yes. Well, I think the question of sustainability and particularly in the area of the arts, for example, which it's there. When people talk about sustainability, they say things like, "Well, this should be self-sustaining without donors." And so, how do you? I think it's very hard to the revenue model, the business model for the arts requires subsidy, particularly if you want access for community. And so there are two ways of looking at this. One, the community contribution needs to be indexed to the ability of the community, and particularly if you're talking about lower income communities, to participate and to also be creatives. Some of the best art, culture, dance, theater, music, you name it, comes from people who are often the most marginalized. And yet they are often in the formal presentation excluded because of the cost of entry. Right? And so if you live in a society where people believe that everyone should have access, most people who want, then there has to be a business model that says there's going to be revenue for sustainability, but there also has to be a commitment from government, from donors, to help sustain it, and not just for them. So there's never a question of sustainability if it's serving the rich. Because we who are privileged like to create things to serve ourselves. In America, the data on philanthropy is quite stark. What you actually find in America is that the vast majority of philanthropic dollars every year goes to primarily wealthy institutions that primarily serve wealthy people. For example, the categories are elite colleges and universities who serve the children of the best hospitals, who are the hospitals who serve the elites, right? I mean, you start to see by category how, and the arts organizations that serve the elites. So Lincoln Center or the Kennedy Center, but not the Harlem School of the Arts. And so I believe we donors, we who are privileged, have to be honest and call this out and not put the burden of sustainability on the very communities who are producing most of the creative energy and most of what we who are wealthier like to consume. But we want to pay for it for ourselves and for our children, but not for the poor or the children. And we have in America, there's this saying about a crisis in arts education, where arts education has been taken out of the public schools, and we have a crisis of arts education. There is no crisis of arts education in America for the wealthy and the privileged. There is, at the schools where the children of those Americans attend, there is massive arts education. It's where the poor children are attending. So you can have in Greenwich, Connecticut, the wealthiest community on the East Coast, schools with instruments and Steinway pianos, and 15 miles away in Bridgeport, Connecticut, primarily black and poor, no arts education. Right. And the philanthropists and the taxpayers in Greenwich are prepared to do that, but not in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And so we donors have to name that and stop putting the burden of sustainability on the very communities who are producing the art but who don't have the resources to consume their own art and creativity.
Thank you. Hopefully this is food for thought for all of us in Nigeria. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I should get a picture too.
Oh, good.
Media,
Yeah.
please.
Media. Oh, Mike, no, we don't want to take a picture.
We will be moving into the panel discussion. We've heard a lot about sustainable giving, sustainable philanthropy, and we'll be inviting two strong women who have been doing amazing work in that space. The first person is Mrs. Toyosi Ogunshiji, the chairperson of the Victim Support Fund COVID-19 Task Force. Mrs. Toyosi. The other person is Mrs. Foluke Ademokun, Executive Coordinator of the Ajoke Aishat Afolabi Foundation. And this session will be moderated by our very own Sheon Ajibola, Manager at PwC Nigeria.
Good afternoon once again. Good afternoon, Ms. Toyosi and Ms. Folake. So we'll go straight to the questions. Starting with Ms. Toyosi, please can you tell us a bit about yourself and in a few words, what do you do at VSF?
Thank you, Sean. My name is Toyosi Akirele. I'm sure a number of people would be wondering why I'm representing Victim Support Fund today. Because I typically work at the intersection of data and artificial intelligence for development. But I volunteer with the Victim Support Fund, which is the first private sector-led humanitarian initiative founded by the federal government of Nigeria. I've been the youngest member of that presidential committee since 2014, and our work started specifically to respond to the needs of internally displaced persons and vulnerable households in the northeast of Nigeria. Our chairman is General Theophilus Yakubu Danjuma, retired, popularly known as TY Danjuma. So he's my chairman. But during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, he had graciously asked that, inaugurated a task force in the middle of the COVID issue and asked me to be the chair. And I had the privilege of chairing that task force and intervening in all the 36 states of Nigeria, including, in addition to the Federal Capital Territory. And, all of that work covered from providing food and, medical items to PPEs, all of the data that you were seeing the NCDC sharing on a daily basis to sort of prepare you for the death rates and the daily infection rates. Those telesurveillance and data monitoring equipment were donated by my task force to the NCDC. All of the boreholes across all the 36 states of Nigeria that we donated, specifically in high-density population environments like schools and primary healthcare centers were also there. What you also know today as the National Pandemic Response Action Plan of the federal government of Nigeria, I, spearheaded that project with the Federal Ministry of Health and the federal government. When you ask me the next question, I'll have the opportunity to answer you more. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. All right, Mrs. Folake, can you also just give us a very brief introduction of yourself and what you do at AAAF?
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to the Ford Foundation and PwC for asking me to be here. I work for Ajoke Aishat Afolabi Foundation. It's called AAAF or Triple AF, as some call it. Founded by Dr. Taiwo Afolabi. Dr. Afolabi is the group vice chair of the CFAX group. So if you have been to the airport, you use some of the logistic services of the CFAX group. We are in 3 sectors. We work within the education sector, economic empowerment, and health. And we have reached over 30,000 vulnerable households. We work with women and children, particularly widows. Every quarter, every term, we send about over 1,000 children to school to pay their tuition fees. Sometimes people say, oh, why are you doing that? They should. But I'm very, very glad with what happened, I think some weeks back in Nigeria, where the Speaker of the Niger State of Assembly decided that his constituency project was to marry 100 girls off. And I said, thank God that we saved some girls from being married off as constituency project. We support hospitals also, public hospitals, primary healthcare facility. We have one but the one we built ourselves in Ogun State, where we immunize children, and we also support women with grants for economic empowerment across Nigeria. We operate from Abia, Umar here in Abia, Zaria in Kaduna, and of course we have an office in Lagos where we work to reach partners across Nigeria.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So, Mrs. Toyosi,
Toyosi.
All right.
Don't worry.
Thank you. So I'm just going to take us back a bit to during the COVID pandemic, which we feel that is one of the most impactful time in our world's history. What has VSF? How were you able to respond so quickly to that effect? And in the approach you used, how do you think we can use this in our sustainable goals and cascade it to long-term sustainable goals?
I think that one of the most traumatizing experiences I had chairing that program was to have arrived at Abuja on the night of, I think, the 4th of April 2020, and myself chairing a victim support fund program became a victim. There were no hotels for me to sleep that night. I called everybody in Nigeria that I knew, but they weren't going to take me because they needed me to have quarantined. And I was coming from Lagos, which was a very risky environment. So, but my biggest lesson, which I think is the reason why we should all take this conversation as convened by Ford and PwC this afternoon very seriously, is the fact that I am confident that we have not as a country learned anything from that COVID-19 pandemic. And learning points is what gives you data. Data is what you use to drive critical decision making and policy design and development. For one, I saw a country, 200 million people, perhaps one of the biggest economies in Africa, creating emergency tents with SAV stickers to be able to create environments for people to quarantine and to be healed. How many primary healthcare centers have we built after the COVID-19 pandemic? Because you would have assumed that a country that could not immediately respond to a pandemic of that nature would have immediately responded, to that. But the point for me is, when we talk about sustainable philanthropy, the question that I asked myself as I prepared for this session is, when are we going to move from feel-good philanthropy to actual human-centered philanthropy? Because what I see is a lot of people wanting to do it because it looks fancy. People want to say, I gave this person this and I gave that person. What are we doing about impact assessment, monitoring and evaluation? Even the donors who give grants to NGOs, where the CEOs of those NGOs are driving flashy cars, are using those monies to do other things. Those are the fundamental issues we should be talking about, because frankly, talk doesn't cook rice. We can do as many workshops and conferences as we want to, but during the pandemic, the question I asked was, how do you begin to separate the emergency preparedness response and response mechanism between legacy diseases and diseases that would rapidly come out of nowhere? So legacy diseases are malaria, HIV, cancer, and all those things we're trying to find cure to. But COVID came out of nowhere. You would have assumed that state governments over the last 4 years would have taken critical learning points from the COVID-19. I went to schools in Ibadan, in Olubadan High School. The children, we turned on taps of water, and the children were dancing around the community because they were going to use the toilets 2 kilometers away from that school. That school exists in one of the most metropolitan, cities in this country. In a school in Asokoro, they were going to fetch water from the nearest embassy. Why? Look, the problem is we need to think about the equitable allocation of resources in this country. We are a country where the rich believe that, their power, the day we put power in the hands of the rich people without demanding some level of mandatory accountability from them, because that wealth comes from our commonwealth as a people. The reason why I say that is because at the end of the day, you must think about the fact that this philanthropy is only sustainable when it is community inclined, when Ford Foundation is able to collaborate with local philanthropies, where we're able to build the capacity of the local philanthropy. One of the things that made us extremely successful during COVID, having offices in only Abuja, Borno, Yobe, Adamawa, Taraba, and those other 3 states, is because we worked with religious institutions, traditional organizations. There were boreholes where there were situations where contractors collected money and did not deliver the items to them. But then the king of the village will call us at VSF and say, this is what is going on. If we did not involve them, you cannot solve a problem for people without critical stakeholder management and carrying them along. The problem is that we sit in Abuja and Lagos and assume that we understand the problems of all the 36 states of Nigeria. You need philanthropy in the hands of the people that are willing to get into the boxing ring and get their noses bloody. It is supposed to be down and dirty work. You are serving the poor people. It is not a fancy responsibility. We cannot continue to quote statistics about out-of-school children and out-of-school children and out-of-school children when the best doctors and the best lawyers and the best AI people in this country. The government of the UK convened the Artificial Intelligence Safety Summit to talk about ethical and responsible AI. They took only 2 of us from Nigeria, from around the world. Nigerians are the brightest and the best people. Those communities in the north where there is poverty, endemic poverty. Put a mobile phone in the hand of a young girl. Come back in 3 days. She cannot speak English. She has never read or written. But if you give her that mobile phone, they would unravel it within 24 hours. Critical thinking and creative thinking is what builds populations at the bottom of the pyramid. It is not a money problem. We have enough money in this country to go around. And frankly, we've depended so much on aid. We now need to be able to create we need to move from sustainable philanthropy to sustainable wealth creation, where people, we can reduce that divide between the poor and the rich. And there are systems where I was asking Dr. Chichi and Agola, I said, how many, if I have $1 million today, where is the data that I can use to access the people that I can support? That's the reason why, because everybody wants to support the person in his village. How do you determine who is poor? When you see internally displaced persons in the north, how do you design the standard profile of what an IDP is? Because I see people queuing to collect food, and I'm like, madam, you are wearing Anko, gele, wrapper and shirt. You have a wristwatch and bracelet. You are not the poor person I'm trying to give this food. Look, I went to Benue State in Kwande at the border of Cameroon, and we were trying to distribute nutrition packs to poor children. And the children there, they look so pretty. I said, I need to reprofile. I'm looking for children with kwashoko, the ones who their heads have been eaten off by kokoro and all those things. Those are the ones that are standard profile. You've forgotten that there are IDPs in this country because we're not doing M&E. Where camp leaders, I went to an IDP camp in government, and the girls in that local, on the list of the people that were supposed to be giving food items, there were only young girls and young boys. And I said, we cannot find I can't see widows on this place. I can't see women carrying children on their backs. I don't see people living with disabilities. Those are the people that philanthropy should be touching. Go and look for them for me. When we investigated further, we found out that the camp leaders who were men had negotiated sex with the young girls. And so they give them, whenever your interventions, all of us, go to those communities, you leave them for camp leaders, go back to Abuja and write your fancy reports and send them to the US. The person who is receiving it in that IDP camp does not need it, but is the girlfriend of the camp leader. But because we are not monitoring, we are not evaluating, we are not checking. Finally, during COVID, We did a lot of advocacy around social distancing, social distancing. We forgot the people in the backwaters of this country, who are 18 people that sleep in one room and do not have a choice of social distancing. How do we respond to those people in sustainable philanthropy?
Thank you very
Thank you
much.
very much.
Thank you. All right. Talking about Ms. Folake, talking about she's mentioned a few strategies and recommendations, and engaging local communities. In your work in your NGO, how have you been able to engage local communities, involve them in decision making, knowing that this is where help really should go to? How have you been able to do that? And when it comes to initiatives, how do you ensure that the people who really need it, the voices are heard? How have you been able to achieve this?
We do not, consider them as beneficiaries. We work with them as partners. That's established from the onset, and that means we involve them in all that we do. Like we have a platform for widows. Widows, we call it Widows Connect, to enable widows participate in the decision-making process. They also help to identify women who have just been widowed, who will need some form of support. They are involved in building some emotional capacity for such widows, to help them with their household. And we also have a student forum where we involve scholars on education programs to participate in some form of discussions. Like they come together to identify issues, and amongst them they get speakers who will come and discuss what the issues are. They participate in that form of discussions in itself, and where they identify any problem where they can solve it, they come, because we have like a process, a chain of engagement. We have staff members who are also coordinating some of these cohorts, to have discussions with them. And at the community level, because we are family focused, once somebody is a widow, for instance, I'm just using that as an example, that the first point, okay, I'm a widow, I need this, but from the discussions you are having with them, you just discover that some other issues are emerging. But you don't just think that they don't have some contributions to make to the decisions that affect their lives. You also involve them in the decision making process. So all through they are involved. We do iterative engagement. You don't just you are providing services to people and you leave them to themselves. You have to follow up to engage them. They come to our office to have such discussions. And I've also found that across even beyond the people that we serve with government, that the SDG days, the United Nations International Days, provide very ample opportunity for you to engage even government, because there are initiatives that we have taken through maybe Women's Day, Widows Day, that even the government at the local level themselves are sustaining that. And lastly, to our point about going to international body for AIDS, I don't think we should say that. I think the international community also in some way owes some debt to Africa, to Nigerians. Some of us were calling for reparation, but I think wherever we can work together, it shouldn't be seen from the point of the masters fund. We are partners, and there are a lot of opportunities that the international bodies can also provide, working with Nigerians.
Thank you very much. So we won't go too deep into what we feel about the international and local, but I'll just go straight to our recommendation, because the purpose of this whole event is to see what are the learning points, where can we learn from, how can we leverage technology, how can we leverage network collaboration, how can we leverage all of this to be able to meet and align ourselves with the UN Sustainable Development Goals in Nigeria. So how can we as local people here, and I will start with Mr. Osi and then yourself, just to round up this session, how can we then leverage technology, data, collaboration, networking, how can we move forward to be able to get, to be able to achieve these sustainable goals that we've, set ourselves to? Thank you.
I think that the point that I made was collaboration between the local and the international philanthropies. I didn't say that they shouldn't, the international philanthropies. I actually referenced the fact that it's important for us to not over depend on them, but to be able to, in the language of Gen Zs, show our workings in a way that means that, that shows that we're delivering value on the resources that have been invested in the country. On recommendations, I have just a few. Number one, the role that technology would play in sustainable philanthropy is data depends on, I talked about transitioning from feel-good philanthropy to human-centered philanthropy. And it would, so we've moved on from previous problems like, diseases and lack of education and all that, to unmitigated artificial intelligence, to pandemics that break out of nowhere. Because the problem again is how much of this data makes us susceptible to risk as a country and as a continent. And those are fundamental issues we need to begin to discuss around the role that technology plays in our society and all of that. But first, I asked a question and said, if I'm a HNI in this country, high net worth individual, and I'm trying to do some type of philanthropic work, where do I go? Who do I speak to? Where's a central national database? And I think that this is a role that coordinated, organized philanthropy between the international and local organizations can work on. A central database where we can even know who is an IDP, who matches the profile of an IDP in terms of sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, age, gender, and all of that. People are working so haphazardly. If you go to the Ministry of Humanitarian Affairs in Abuja, what they're doing is different from what all the ministries of humanitarian affairs in all the 36 states of this country. And it's going to be difficult for anyone to take Nigeria seriously. Number two, you also need to think about the fact that the problems are unique from community to community, state to state. So when you come to a state like Lagos, where there's huge, economic resources, and then you go to states like Gombe, like Ekiti, that are like number 30-something on the federal government allocation list, then you wonder, how do you judiciously allocate resources? Should you not give Lagos because Lagos has? Because Lagos still has its own inherent problems. Climate change, flooding, environmental issues and all of that. But then you also have bigger issues in the north, in other parts of the south of this country where people are extremely poor. And there's, very little quality, very minimal quality education that would lift those people out of poverty. I think, number one, the role that we would play as practitioners in this space in ensuring harmonized data, not just haphazard data like what we have, such that when someone like Mr. Gbenga Oyebode, he knows his way around, but if Mr. Oyebode decides to want to do philanthropy, who are the institutions that have the capabilities to be able to render this, support in terms of providing the data so that we are sure that the resources are reaching the right people? That's number one. Number two, and my final recommendation is capacity building is very crucial. Capacity building is extremely crucial because I sit on the board of a couple of foundations, local foundations, and frankly, I think we could make do with a little bit more of best practice. Because Mr. Frank Agbogun alluded to the fact that Ford Foundation is 100 years old, done incredible work, by the way, here in Nigeria and Africa. But the question is, how do we allow local foundations to be able to learn from the repository of knowledge? How do we train the trainers? I'm very particular about monitoring and evaluation because you can put $100 million. We've sunk aid into this country. I sat in the UNDP 3 years ago where they were reviewing their 20-year investments in Nigeria. We spend so much money on democracy, democratic governance, democracy and all that in this country. We still don't have democracy and good governance. So we've sunk aid in this country. We've now come to the point where we now need aid that works for the people. And it would only work for the people when we know who they are. And when we know who they are, we need to know what their needs are. When we know what their needs are, then how do we give it to them? When we know how do we give it to them, then we go back to measure if this that we give to them is useful for them. So it's not so much about the what. We've committed $200 million to this. 5 of the biggest world foundations have put $200 million on artificial intelligence for public interest. I'm working on that project with MacArthur Foundation, but the first thing we decided to do was to map what does success look like 10 years from now. It's very important to do that end-to-end analysis before we sit together to then say this is how this money is should be spent. So number one is data. Number two is capacity building. When we have this convening next year, we really want to be able to see local NGOs who have better capacity, better staff, because, and that would depend on the kind of reward systems that we place on them, because frankly, if you want the philanthropy space to attract the best of talent, to be able to do the same kind of incredible job that the people at Ford and PwC do, then we cannot go and scratch the bottom to be able to find those people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, thank you very much. So one last question for you, Ms. Folake. She's mentioned harmonized database, she's mentioned capacity building, monetary and evaluation, and measuring success. So when you've given, how do you measure that, it's used for what it's meant for? Is there anything you want to add to this as part of your recommendations?
Yes, I agree with her absolutely in terms of collecting data, just to help to understand the capacity of organizations that are even working, and to also be able to map, just for mapping, purpose, map, their strength, map, their, contributions, to overall, impact. And also, as you are mapping, the provider, you are also, mapping, people from the demand, side, so that each organization, this is where my strength is, and this is how far, I can go. Cool. I also think, mapping, will help in terms of, harmonization. I think she talked about that. Yes, because the Sustainable Development Goals is just about reduction or elimination of poverty in all its forms. So when you have data, okay, how far have we gone in terms of achieving or contributing to the overall achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. I will also thank God we are here with PwC. One area of concern for me that I think our data can help us with. It's also when you talk about fiscal policies, reforms of our fiscal policies, reform of our tax policies, because government also has to be involved in philanthropic activities for it to be sustainable. How can we reform our tax policy in a way that it will support giving? Because if the environment is created that is enabled for philanthropists, individuals, or corporations, to contribute, to give, it will help, to sustain that act of giving. All so right. For me, reforms, I think that should be able to contribute to reforms in taxation also.
Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much, Ms. Olina. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sorry. So we have in our midst the Honorable Commissioner, Ministry of Commerce, Cooperatives, Trade and Investment, Lagos State, Mrs. Folashade Ambrose Medebem.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, all. I'm really delighted to be here. My mandate, obviously, as a public servant representing Lagos State. I've reflected and listened a lot to what's been said so far. And I started to reflect. And the question that really sort of revolves with me when we're looking at the particular topic, an urgent economic crisis intervention. So the question that I started to ask myself is, what is the opposite of crisis? And for me, it's breakthrough. And I'm really delighted when I listened to my dear Toyosi mention the fact that when I also listened to your presentation, Mrs. Akers, and you listed all the sort of critical elements, I believe data is one of the biggest, for me, ranks number one, I suppose. So my question really is, we have key people all, in this room today. How can we shift from a situation of economic crisis to economic breakthrough under the umbrella of sustainable philanthropy to wealth? That's mainly my question. And also, when I wear the hat representing Lagos State. We are very conscious, as you know, under the leadership of Mr. Governor, Baba Jide Olushola Sanwo-Olu, that the public sector cannot do everything. And so obviously my coming here, I'm thinking, so what's my action? What's the actionable thing that I can take away? And I'm delighted when I see Mr. Oyebode here, and the fact that you mentioned that he's also on the foundation. How can we really try and understand what we can take away from here today by way of a collective action? So that's my question. What's the actionable thing whereby Lagos State can actually work, i.e. public sector, with everyone here, capacity building, crucially harmonized data? I suppose that's my question, really. Thank you. A loaded one.
I think the question of what's the action is a function of just how committed the community here is. So just on the issue of data and harmonized and standardized data, everybody can't have data because then no one has data. If in fact data is a proprietary thing, there has to be a centralized, high-functioning entity that is the go-to provider of data. And it is often through public-private partnership that is created. In the United States, probably on issues related to urban populations, there is one entity that the Ford Foundation and the government together created called the Urban Institute. It is the go-to think tank, policy center, data collection repository on cities in America. And that is because a group of philanthropists and the government created a partnership with a laser-like focus on urban demography. And so there has to be a commitment from some group of philanthropists and some leader in government who makes it a priority. It's not going to happen otherwise. I don't have an easy answer because it's in a country like Nigeria, it's complex, but it's completely achievable. There are countries that are poorer than Nigeria that have figured this out, and it's because they have taken a clear focus and set a moonshot, a breakthrough opportunity 5 years, 10 years away, by which the data or whatever the objective is will be achieved. Thank you. Thank you very much. Of course, please, ma'am. Yes. The madam in the back.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Annette Akinshete. I'm Dr. Annette Akinshete. I'm a doctor, yes. I specialize in preventive and social medicine, otherwise known as public health. I'm the National Director and CEO of Sickle Cell Foundation Nigeria. Sickle Cell Foundation Nigeria is 30 years this year, and it was established to fill a gap. Incidentally, I was the first desk officer as a young doctor in the 80s in the Federal Ministry of Health for non-communicable diseases. That is those diseases that you can't catch, But across the globe in the West, when we went to the UN and to the WHO in Geneva, everybody else at that time were looking at hypertension, diabetes, cancers, anything but sickle cell. So it was Professor Kuti at the time as a pediatrician who thought Nigeria should include sickle cell in its non-communicable disease. That's where we are today. However, having done a massive survey to determine how much of sickle cell we had and other non-communicable diseases, the reports and the whole purpose was to anchor control programs on the data that came out of that survey. Massive community-based survey. But the reports We're kept on the shelves all these years, nothing has been done. That I digress. But the reason I'm saying this is this. When we ask as government, ask that of persons in the philanthropy space, what can we do, what should we do? I think it's government that should set the pace, give us direction, give us policies and focus. Then, and how do you do that? When you come bring up your policies, formulate policies, you bring stakeholders together. And then if anyone is working in an area that you feel is important, then government says, here is our plan, here's our policy, this is where I think you should come in. It is not for entities outside of government to determine where Nigeria wants to go, at the national level or sub-national levels. I was privileged to have, as I said, to have served Nigeria for 35 years. And when PEPFAR, if you remember who was PEPFAR, PEPFAR is President Bush's aid for AIDS, something fund for AIDS, I think that's what it was. When PEPFAR came in those days, they came in full force with everything, with doctors, with nurses, with name it. But it was good that we had the minister at the time who put his foot down, that we have all this personnel. So go back. This is not where we want you to be. This is our plan. This is where we want you to fit. In other words, the policy was clear and direction was clear. Where stakeholders would come in was also clear. That is important for us as government. If you're government at any level, bring stakeholders together, come up with a very clear policy with directions and determine what the roles of your stakeholders would be, including the philanthropy space, charity, whatever we call them, grant makers and so on. I think that is so important for us to understand and take away. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, madam. But I was just thinking that when it comes to public policy, there should be some form of collaboration, between the state actors and the non-state actors. Because sometimes, when government says, "Oh, I'm giving the direction," for instance, in the philanthropic space, where most of the time individuals, companies, are putting, their funds, I think it's important that government will sit, because it helps that way, getting all of your information, just from bottom to the top before you start, taking decisions. We have seen the NDE, for instance, the Nigeria National Directorate of Employment. They have boreholes, some mostly in those rural areas that people are not even making use of, because there was no consultation with the communities that they have provided, that service to. Thank you.
Yeah, just take pictures. Dara, please wait. More pictures. Anyone else wants to join? Please feel free to. Yeah. Sorry. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for such powerful conversations. Before I hand over to Dr. Chichi to give the closing remark, I guess the call to action for everyone present here today is the need for us to have a think tank. Philanthropy goes beyond just giving. It needs to be done strategically. which means that all the relevant stakeholders within that ecosystem needs to work together. So if you have any ideas on how you think we can achieve this together, feel free to reach out to PwC, Ford Foundation, or even our media partners, Business Day Media. Thank you. Dr. Chichi.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for honoring our invitation. My big thanks goes to PwC for all the work that they've done in putting this together. It was a lot of hard work to have everything in order, and we're grateful that this has happened and happened well. We're also very grateful to Darren Walker, our very visionary leader, who has done so well in leading the Ford Foundation to where it is today, and our board member, Mr. Yebode, who has been an excellent and fantastic partner and friend and mentor to the West Africa office. I'm also very grateful to the staff of the Ford Foundation who have worked day and night to make Darren's visit work, and those who came from New York with him as well, Tara and Gail, who are here. But my biggest thanks goes to all of you, who made our time to come and be with us today, because without you, there will be no event. I'm very grateful to the panelists who participated, Foluke and Toyosi. Really grateful for the time that you have spent and what it is that you have shared with us. Everybody's talked about local philanthropy, and it's something that we are very passionate about because we recognize that a lot of the donor funding that supports civil society is actually dwindling because of the crisis around the world and conservative governments being elected all over the world. Philanthropy, donor funding is going down everywhere. And so it is our desire, but of course the needs are going up, as poverty increases in many countries, especially our own. So it is so important for us that local philanthropy, fills that space, and that we begin to do it in a way that is sustainable, in a way that really addresses the core challenges of poverty and underdevelopment. And so at the Ford Foundation, we're offering two things, and I was glad to hear Toyosi say that those were the things that were needed, so we're talking to our constituents. We're offering capacity building for the staff of foundations, especially the leadership of foundations, especially for those who are interested in moving from charity to development. And we know that many times the leadership may not be as grounded as they should be in the non-profit sector. So we're happy to provide that support. So if there's any non-profit organization here that feels that they need capacity, they should get in touch with us, and we'll be working with a reputable institution to put that together. The second thing that we're offering is match funding. We want to be able to work with local philanthropists, and we want to work with them on issues that we think are critical to development. And so, but areas in which they are also interested in, we're not imposing any areas. So if there's anybody, any philanthropists here, any foundations who are interested in working with, through civil society organization, working in a critical area of development, especially on core issues, we will not be giving rise to people in communities. Apologies for that in advance. But if we want to think about how do we revolutionize the healthcare sector, how do we revolutionize the education sector, how do we make development happen, those kinds of issues are things that we're going to be looking at, and we will match you 50%. So we'll bring 50% of whatever it is you will have spent, in that area of work. So I hope that these two, that the conversations, this is the second in our series. We're hoping to have one every quarter if we can manage it. But this is the second in our series, and we're hoping that between these conversations and the partnership that we're offering, that will be able to make the difference that we need in enhancing local philanthropy. And before I end, I want to say a big thank you to Business Day, especially to Frank, who did the fire chat conversation. Business Day is a new partner with us, but we have seen the wealth that they bring to it, and we are hoping that we will continue this partnership. Have an absolutely wonderful day, and thank you so much for coming out.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chichi, for wrapping this up for us nicely. So it really doesn't end here. Let's keep the conversations going. Feel free, like I said, to reach out to PwC, Ford Foundation, or Business Day. Thank you to everyone who has been part of this event. We wish you a safe drive back home. If you came in your private jet, we wish you a safe flight back home. Lunch is served outside. Please feel free, help yourselves. Feel free to network as well. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.